各位观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎收看 J 与 J 论坛，由我 Jimmy 马健与我们的好朋友 Jim 诺威来跟大家聊聊这个礼拜的时事。Jim, how are you doing?
Doing fine. Another beautiful winter day in Houston. I'm sure glad we're not in the Northeast.
It's the 70s, so this is summer for a lot of places up north.
I know. My wife and I have been going around various parts of Houston the last few days, and it literally spring is here. Dogwoods are out. We think magnolias are going to come out pretty soon. So it's an early spring. So anyway, that's all the reason people should be moving to Houston. But I give them a caution: please move here in the winter. That's the best thing to do.
Yeah, it is. It's the humidity here is oppressing. I've always said that I enjoy colder weather because I'm born and raised in Houston, but all my friends up north tell me I will not enjoy it when I have to dig myself out of snow, which is what they're going up through in the Northeast, or have to shovel my driveway just to get out the house. So the grass is not always greener up north.
But I think the distinction is over discussed to Houston's detriment. Here's my point. The hottest and humidest I've ever been is in Foggy Bottom in Washington, D.C. in August. And in August in Manhattan, it is oppressively hot and humid. And it's just as bad in Manhattan, Philadelphia, and Baltimore and Washington. The difference is in those cities, you have summer in that way is about mid-July through mid-September. In Houston, it's mid-May through mid-October or even into November. So it's the same thing, but with same peak, but with a much longer band. So, but it is what it is, and we've learned to live with it, and we have air conditioning in everything we do, and we burn a lot of energy, but since energy is cheap, that's okay. And since we produce it here, even better.
We have Houstonians that escape the heat in the summer to go to Colorado or Idaho and whatnot, with a very large group of Houstonians up there in the summertime. And that will be the best way, because the other 6 months that is not humid and hot, Houston is very pleasant. Like right now, this is great weather. Now, I don't know about I know it's great weather here, and we know global warming is real, but I know that President Biden's new administration has quite a few problems already within the past few weeks. We were going to talk about what happened in Burma and in Russia. Mm-hmm. Could you tell our audience a little bit, what is your take on the military coup, the junta's coup on Burma? And by the way, I insist on using Burma. I want to tell our audience a little bit why, because Burma has been the historical name of the country. The junta changed it to Myanmar in 1989, I believe, after they massacred thousands of people. So in DC, for our State Department, we still use the name Burma. Now, other countries have slowly over the past few decades accepted the other name that the military has decided to use. So what is your take on what's going on in Burma, and what do you think about using the name itself even?
Well, I understand what you mean, and I would prefer, for both semantic reasons and historical and political reasons, that we use the word Burma. But if they want to be called Myanmar, I've always said to people, whatever you want to be called, I'll call you. And that has lots of ramifications in many ways. But okay, let's just use the word Burma. I'm happiest with that as well. Mm-hmm. It's broken back into the headlines this week, but there's really nothing new. The Burmese government has been behaving this way for a very, very long time. They've been oppressing the minority, and they've had various pogroms, ethnic cleansing programs, on and again for consistently as long as I can remember, at least 15 years or so. The thing that makes it a little more complicated now than maybe it was 10 or 15 years ago is Aung San Suu Kyi entered the whole situation after she won the Nobel Peace Prize approximately 15 years ago. And when she linked up with the Myanmar government, many people around the world from all political stripes thought that she would be a strong influence in moderating the Myanmar junta's behavior. And that really has not been the case. I think she's very troubled by it. Certainly her international reputation is troubled by it. And it seems like whatever her role may have been, whatever her objectives may have been, she has not been effective in changing the course of events or the tide of this behavior. And so it's large, it's strong, and I think most people outside the country are not sure that everybody is extremely troubled by it, saddened by it, etc., but nobody really knows what the best thing to do about it is. Now, why is it so troublesome on an international basis? Because most Western countries, Western democracies, certainly the United States, Japan, virtually all of Europe, looks at other countries and is offended, deeply troubled by any kind of human rights abuses that go in or go on within the borders of other countries. The question is, do you invade the sovereignty of those other countries and try to correct the situation in one way or another, or do you respect international sovereignty and let countries be countries? And we've had this problem all over the world for a very, very long time, including Rwanda and Burundi 20 years ago, to all throughout recent history in Saudi Arabia, in parts of the country of Iran. We can just go right down a list of countries and behaviors, including North Korea. Why should the civilized world tolerate that misbehavior? And if we're willing to tolerate it, what does that say about our true commitment to protecting human rights? And this whole thing is flaring relative to China and the Uyghurs all over again. And it's brought not just from the political world, international sovereignty or domestic sovereignty, etc., but it's now creeping into labor practices, manufacturing practices, all these other things. This is a huge moral and ethical issue, as well as international diplomacy. That's why it's so difficult. Do I have a solution? No, I don't. I other than providing sanctions, trying to isolate the bad guys, if you will, and trying to provide respite for the affected people. By the way, back to other parts of the Middle East. Look what's gone on in Syria the last 5 years or so, okay? You have massive refugees all suffering from variations of the same problems. So there you go, okay? That's an explanation of the obvious.
I beg to differ, because, we're being Western educated. Our perspectives are, with or without knowing, are guided by our foreign policy, by media, by this narrative of our democracy works, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. And because, what's happening in Russia and Burma, there's no doubt that it is not a democratic process. But I have to tell you, living in different countries, I've lived in Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, here in the US, knowing friends from there, not just visiting as a tourist, makes a big difference when people could tell you what's going on. We have to stop fitting this square peg into a round hole by assuming and, like you said, interfering with other country. So since World War II, we did not get involved until we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. That was a mistake. We should have really got involved a lot earlier. But ever since then, we failed in trying to replicate our process, our model in other countries, because we all know that in a democracy, educated voters matters, poverty matters, more medium income, stable economy. It took over 200 years for us to get there. A lot of countries, look at Venezuela. We ended up having another dictator. Look at USSR, Arab Spring, and there were a lot of inroads that were made, but all reverted back to authoritarian or dictatorships. Bringing up China is a very sensitive issue because it is very easy to use China as a target. I think Mr. Trump started doing that, but the fact is, if you look at what China's media is saying, or non-U.S. media, we're called terrorists. We're called infringing. We did infringe on human rights, whether in Middle East, South America, Middle America. I mean, we have using drones to hunt down civilians, Blackwater incidents. So I have so many examples to give you that there's all different perspective. Now I want to go back to Burma. Burma means a lot to me personally. I'm gonna give you. Do you mind if I give you a little backstory of Burma? Because you mentioned Aung San Suu Kyi, you mentioned the history.
Sure.
What's going on?
I think our listeners, our viewers, would like that perspective as well. So
as a Chinese American, so Burma was a very important battleground during World War II. My maternal grandfather fought for the. Back then, it wasn't communist rule, right? China was China, the democratic China. Mm-hmm. We fought with the allies with British and U.S. forces in Burma. China was invaded by Japan. Burma was under Japan rule. They took over from the British. So Burma was a British colony for a long time. And then the Japanese took over. Well, China at the time was left with only a few provinces on the western end. The majority of China was almost done. They are about to take over. And then Japan made the mistake of attacking us in Hawaii, in Pearl Harbor. So U.S. started parachuting and bringing troops through the west side because they couldn't get through on the eastern seaboard because Japan controlled it. They had to go through Burma. Burma was a battleground. So British forces were trapped there. My grandfather, with the Chinese army, Western trained in the U.S., by the way, was able to defeat. That his commander was Sun Liren. He was educated at West Point, one of the very few back in the day in World War II that was educated here. Chinese national, went back, used the skills he learned to lead because Chinese army back then was very ill-funded and ill-equipped. We've been fighting have been fighting Japanese invasion for 10, 15 years by then without U.S. help. So finally, when U.S. declared war, Chinese military was able to get the help. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather was able to save a regiment of British soldiers. These are in the news, and it was in books. There's historical facts. Mm-hmm. What makes a big impression for me was when I was in middle school, my parents flew me back to Taiwan to help translate for my grandfather because he was awarded a Silver Star by the U.S. Army 50 years late, but he deserved it. Somebody had asked for it, not him, because what he did was very brave. Most of his comrades died during this battle with us, the allies, U.S., British, Chinese army against Japanese. Mm-hmm. So Burma means a lot to me. I've read a lot about it, and there were, after World War II ended and the communists came and took over, a huge part, a big group of Free China's military went into Burma because this borders China with Yunnan, went into Burma and basically lived there for many, many years because they were stuck in no man's land. They couldn't go back to China because they would be executed. We as in the national government of China, which is Taiwan, they couldn't get them out of Burma. And they wanted to leave them there to have a chance to recover China from communists. So all this is the backstory. So now let me tell you why our perspectives, me and you actually have the same perspective because we're Western educated. But I was able to get the local perspective. The problems in Myanmar and Burma and a lot of the Southeast Asian countries that are having problems now, it still comes down. We're not blaming, this is historical facts, comes down from the colonization by Western powers. Germany, France, England, and us, we all did the same things. We took advantage of under-civilized or undeveloped countries and carved out land and resources for us, which is every country will do that for their own. So we cannot deny that. The Rohingyas were brought in by the British during their rule from India and Pakistan. Ethnic Burmese will tell you right now that it is not a human rights exception, because how could you bring in millions of people to our country, park them there, and tell them that we have to accept them when you're the same ones that's been enslaving us? If I'm Burmese, I'll tell you that. You cannot say that is a human right. Yes, do I agree with you? Yes. The military and Aung San Suu Kyi has failed. It is a human rights violation. It is genocide. It is, because they're displaced and they're murdered. But for the Burmese, why do they have so much support? For the Burmese, this is a mistake made by the British from 70 years ago. They moved them in at that time to build, and also later on in the war, Rohingyas were helping British and US and Chinese military to fight the Japanese. Guess who ended up helping the Japanese? Majority of Burmese. Why is that? They didn't know, but at that time, they were colonized and treated as slaves by the Brits.
By the British.
For decades. So when they see the Japanese coming in, oh, they're Asian at least, maybe it'll be different. You know, when you grew up in a whole generation of that, you want to rebel it. So they actually accept the Japanese. So think about how hard it is for Burmese. You're colonized by this country, then Japan came. And now Japan's defeated, US and Western countries claim they want to instill the democracy. But what I'm saying is, in the end, for Burmese, Rohingyas they're not Burmese. This is a problem that the British and the Japanese created. They're trying to kick them out because so now do I agree with the way they do it? Of course not. And when you bring up Aung San Suu Kyi, she was under house arrest for probably 15, 16 years. But I never thought of all the Western stories praise her, she's great, but remember, she's an elite too. Her father fought for independence from the Brits. It's a legacy, great. And you know what? I agree. She could just live happily as an expat, like a lot of Vietnamese or Cambodian or Laos, they're wealthy from generations, go to live in Europe, enjoy their life.
I think her husband is English. She could live.
That's right.
She could live forever in England and just write papers and be a media star.
But she didn't, because she loves her country. But then it goes back to this. Have I lost a lot of respect for her? Yes, I have. Because what she fought for, she allowed the military. Now, to be fair, we don't live there. Is she trying? Because she cannot cross the line, because there's no doubt the military controls everything. Aung San Suu Kyi her party has won in landslides in every democratic election since she's released. But yet she could not, because she has no real power, right?
No, she has no power.
So
she had an unappointed role.
So what do we do? I mean, if you, like you said, there's no solution. If we're the State Department, do we assist them like we did? The CIA has interfered in so many countries, and they all turn out horribly for us.
I have an idea for sake of discussion. It's probably politically impractical, but I'll throw it out for fun.
But usually it works when you say that. Well, politically practical doesn't mean it works.
How many Rohingyas are there?
I believe probably like 700,000 or 800,000 that are displaced. Who knows the real numbers? Let's just say 1 million.
Okay, let's say 1 million. The United States is a very big country. It's big in many, many ways. Why don't we offer the opportunity to any Rohingya that wants to come to the United States to come and get an immediate green card we'll figure out where they can live. We can figure out lifestyle and housing and other things like that. We can certainly afford to do that. And then give them a pathway to citizenship, presuming over time that they earn it. But one way or another, they would have a permanent green card. And look, that would not be a whole lot different than what we've done with other ethnic groups.
Vietnamese refugees,
the Vietnamese, the Somalis up in Detroit, in Minnesota. I mean, there are patchwork quilts of groups that have occurred. And I think the United States is stronger for it. And obviously be a huge humanitarian gesture as well.
You sound very, very left, liberal, democratic, progressive right there, because there's no way the Republican Party or conservatives will agree with you. Even I don't agree with you. I tell you why. You're kind and open-minded, and you want to take in refugees. I even tell you that I don't think that's doable. I think that's a great idea. I think it's humane. We got to practice what we preach, but we know that's not doable. Our economy is already in trouble. We have all kinds of problems starting from the pandemic. Bring in 1 million. The political divide, it would, like you said, right? The red tape, it is not possible. And secondly is, a lot of these refugees we took in, I know that in Houston we have a huge number of Hmongs that came from Southeast Asia also.
Who? Hmongs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The town I grew up in, Stockton, California, has a huge Hmong resettlement program, and has had since the mid-70s.
So I'm going to tell you, and there's a lot of Laotians, Laos up in Wisconsin, Cambodians.
Yep.
So when we look at Asians, mainstream media, most Americans think of Asians as high income, highly educated, right? The numbers show that. But if you look closely, not Asians, all Asians are the same. A lot of these new immigrants, specifically Cambodians, Hmongs, Laotians, even the Vietnamese, they're not high income. These resettled refugees never could break it out. It's almost a different caste system here in the United States. Even their children couldn't break out of it. They're amongst the most poor. Rampant poverty and drug use and whatnot in that community. I know that in Wisconsin, that's a big problem. We know that in Houston, so I cannot tell you whether it will work or not if we bring the Rohingyans over here. We know they bipartisan. I know the Republican Party will not allow that. There's no way. I know it will be an uproar. And I know that President Biden's foreign policy and the State Department has a hot potato in their hand. They have condemned this officially as saying it's a coup. The Burmese military has shut down Facebook. So remember we talked about the problem with technology, Jim, about how it could be used against a democratic process or incite crowds. Mm-hmm. But in this case, it does work in some countries because Facebook does allow people to express their opinion. The military had to shut it down. Anytime a dictatorship wants to shut down something, usually we're the opposite, right? We'll think it's a good thing. So there's a double-edged sword. What do you think about what I just said about the problems created by the colonization of Western powers? Because for the people that are oppressed, enslaved, we're not better than the Japanese. That's what the Burmese are basically saying. Mm-hmm. And to them, the Rohingyas, they're outsiders brought in by Western powers. That has nothing to do with them. And that they're still paying for it.
Okay, my simple answer to your question is not only, I think, given the history, the way you conveyed it, I'm sure you're correct. But it's only one of a number of similar examples. Look what happened throughout the Middle East with the drawing of boundaries between Lebanon and Syria, between all of the different ethnic groups, creating the country of Iraq, which is really the sum of Kurds, the part of the Islamic community.
I understand where you're trying to get to. I do. But
and look at what happened with the creation of Israel. Your description of how the ethnic Burmese feel about Uyghurs is very much the same way that native Palestinians feel about the creation of Israel and having the Jews inserted, not only demographically inserted in them, but legally inserted within them. Yeah. And they lost a lot of land and rights and everything else in the entire process. And so, and I'm sure if we were to go country by country in Africa, we would find a whole lot of similar situations as well. So
let's imagine this, okay? I agree with you 100%. Thank you for bringing the perspective. You know, the thing is this, we're not rah-rah, one-sided, this American view, Western view. We have to see other cultures and understand other perspectives to know how to proceed. There's no perfect solution. I tell my friends too, imagine one day this is the strongest the United States have ever been. This last 70 years, 80 years since World War II is a golden age for the United States. Mm-hmm. But let's say we go back to before that, before the Industrial Revolution, before we solidify our government, our process, our military. We're not as strong. Let's say at that time, USSR. Mm-hmm. They have more military might. They're the United States, and we're more like Middle East or China or whatever. Mm-hmm. They decide, hey, look at the U.S. right now. They have problems. So they send military, they send their CIA, KGB, come in and start interfering with us. And then you know what? Look at the political right now. Look at Texas. Texas is red. They don't want to be part of DC and these liberals. Let's start a coup and let Texas be independent. Because that's what the Texans want. Hey, you know what? California is too liberal. They want to have their own country. Let's support a coup there and do this. Does that make sense? What happened in the Middle East will never end. We did not solve any problems. We just created more. The Ottoman Empire was so dominant for centuries. What we're doing in China, am I disagreeing with, do I agree with China? Do I think China has human rights issues? Of course, just like we do. China calls certain people terrorists because their homeland is infringed. There's been mass murders by the terrorists, killing multiple people at train stations, bombs. A lot of people have died. This is real. These are facts. Mm-hmm. Could we say that, hey, they're not terrorists. They're protecting their home and they're doing this. Mm-hmm. Then is Al-Qaeda terrorist? Is Islamic militants terrorists? They're protecting their home too. So when we're accusing other countries but granted, this is unfair too, because when we come back to look at Russia, I have no doubt that Putin is poisoning his people, his adversaries. There's no process. He controls everything. So to me, that is easier to talk about than Burma or Middle East. What do you think about that? What do you think about that perspective?
Well, two or three things. Number one, just because something is easier or more difficult to talk about doesn't mean we shouldn't address it. In fact, sometimes the most difficult, vexing problems are the ones that should require the best thinking and the best resources. But leave that aside for the moment. The other thing is your description of a terrorist. I'll never forget. Many people. One of my heroes in life is Menachem Begin, and Menachem Begin has been described most of the time when he was prime minister and a lot of the Israeli history leading up to it as a freedom fighter. But if you go back and read British press in the 40s, he was called a terrorist because he was blowing up British establishments and doing everything he could to get them the hell out of there. Okay. And so I think a lot of this stuff is just human nature. There are conflicts created by, and I'll be charitable and say mistakes made by others, and just conflicts for anything. And some people want to go beyond the rules, and some people say there are no rules. You do what you have to do. There are no rules, either law or ethics or religion or any other kind of governors on behavior. People do what they have to do. Ultimately, might makes right. And it's a terrible lesson in history. People used to fight over land. Now they're fighting over economics.
Intellectual property, technology.
Yeah. And now we're moving forward into what I'll call cyber wars. And that's the way that power, land used to be a proxy for wealth and therefore power and security, right?
It still is to some extent.
To some extent, and that will never totally go away because of proximity. Economics now the same way. Part of the reason the United States has had such a strong military since after World War I, all the way for the last 100 or so years, is because of our economic might. If we couldn't finance the military establishment and the economy that goes along with our diplomacy, we wouldn't be the superpower that we are. China's figured that out. China said the first thing we have to do is build our economy. Once the economy is strong enough, now we can move to invest in our military, and it's perfectly understandable.
I agree with you completely. But when you talk about military might, the economic engine that drives it, I want to tell you that as somebody that has both cultures, our most influential, at least to this generation and the next, it is not military economic might. It is economic might. It's the soft power, the brand, the entertainment. We're listening to English songs, watching Disney movies, going out drinking Coca-Cola, eating McDonald's. Those are all a part of, I don't want to use the word invasion. Cultural appropriation, in a way, is to take over. So there's a big argument in some countries like
I absolutely think people say, how did Reagan win the Cold War over the Soviet Union? Two things. Number one, the one that history will give him credit for is he figured out early in his program that the Russians were so concerned about their defense and offense that they would match our expenditures, defense expenditures, dollar for dollar.
Yeah.
But our economy at that time was 3 times its size. Yes. So every dollar they spent was 3 times more painful, and ultimately they couldn't keep up. That's the public view. The real view is, it's when McDonald's opened their first outlet in Moscow. Everything began to change, because for the first time, the communists, the proletariat, got a taste of Western goods and Western culture. And the same thing in East Germany and the whole Eastern Bloc. It was the economy and the social aspects, the consumer-driven culture that followed beyond it. And people wanted a better life. And again, I'll give Zhou Enlai and
Zhou Enlai. Wow, you know Zhou Enlai too. Wow.
And I'll give him and every Chinese premier, including Xi Jinping, a lot of credit ever since. What they want to do is to provide a better and better and better life for the people. So they become not only more and more satisfied, but they become ambitious in their own right.
Thank you for saying that. That's very fair, coming from someone. Well, of course, you're not the majority here. We're both we don't represent majority views, but you're way too cultured and too savvy internationally. That's why you could say these. You know, I look at China. I tell people from China when they're criticizing other countries, I was like, do you know, like when they make fun of North Korea, I told them, do you know that barely one generation ago, barely 2, maybe 3 decades ago, we look at China as North Korea. It was a closed country. There was no news coming out. Who knows what was going on? There were cultural revolution. There were all kinds of problems, genocides going on. Nobody will ever know how bad it was. It was so poor. Nobody had TV while we had to send money. Look, it doesn't matter, but we have families stuck there that were massacred because they have relatives in the U.S., right?
Yeah.
So my natural distrust of the Communist Party will never go away. But to be fair, what you just said, I want to reflect on what you said about what they have done to pull that country from a third world country into the number one economy in the world in a short period of time. And also the fact that they focus on economy. People need to have a better life before maybe some personal freedom, political power.
Yeah. Zhou Enlai was a brilliant economic strategist.
He was a great statesman.
Of building the industry along the eastern coast and creating job opportunities that created a whole wave of demographic opportunity for primarily impoverished farmers to come. I mean, it worked over 2 generations. It worked.
But Jim, I will never give them credit because it worked. But to me, the Communist Party have set China back entire 2 generations. From 1949 till 1980s, more people died in China from famine or from political camps than World War II and World War I combined. A lot of people don't know that. And Mao Zedong is, I don't want to start. He's being worshipped as a god. I will never have anything good to say because I studied both sides. We're not brainwashed. This part is not because the U.S. says so. It's because when you look at the numbers and the things he did. China stepped back by him. Any other leader or political party would have brought China back to this point. I really believe that.
Right.
Because China has a 5,000 year, a very deep-rooted culture, and it's a one unified race. Does that make sense? It's the majority are Han. So we don't have, Chinese people doesn't have the racial problems or divide or a caste system. China is very developed economically before the last 200 years, which is really bad. The end of the Qing dynasty and all the colonization from the Western and Japanese powers. I mean, Shanghai was cut up and given out. Taiwan was given out. I mean, they kept losing wars. But the Qing dynasty, because, the emperor system, doesn't work. But free China worked. Then World War II happened. Just a lot of bad breaks. That's the way I look at it. So you are being very fair, because it's easy to just say China is no good, communist is no good. You're giving credit where credit is due, which is important because that's the only way for us to understand and to compete with them. Because look, Jim, my kids, my grandkids, my great grandkids, nobody's going back to China. I mean, we're Americans, we're here to stay. Looking at our power declining because of political infighting or because there's no continuation of policy. Does that make sense? We know Russia and China can wait us out. They know in 4 years, President Biden might be gone, just like they could wait out Mr. Trump because in 4 years or 8 years, they're gone.
China can wait us out. Russia cannot. Russia is in a power dive right now, demographically, economically, and the energy crisis.
They're in trouble, yes.
Is making it much worse.
How do we get rid of Putin?
Oh, nature will take care of that.
Old age?
Well, yes, but I think other things, if Mr. Navalny is anywhere near successful, and I think he will be, and if Putin mistreats him even more than he already has, the movement will rise up around him. He will be like Martin Luther King was here in the United States.
Sir, his doctor that cured him from being poisoned was just murdered today. Putin this guy he was an agent. He was a KGB. I will never trust these, intelligence officials. I don't care what country, because I personally, my family has experienced them, whether you're US or Russian KGB or Chinese or something. These intelligence agents, they all want to create havoc. Putin started out, that's how he came to power. He's the master at manipulating and murdering political adversaries on the side, poisoning people, killing doctors. That is not acceptable. I don't care what system you're in. It's just, sentence them, put them to jail, but I don't believe you. I don't agree with you. That's what I mean. I think his grip on power is so strong, and that the wealth gap in Russia is so wide. There's a few, what is called the oligarchs that controls all. We're putting this shit out. And there's the masses of poor people. And that's it. And I don't see any way out of it unless people are willing to bleed for it, which is a revolution. And Putin is good. He's good. I'm scared of that man.
Well, I mean, we'll see. I don't think people from the outside can really influence what goes on there. Jimmy, I'm looking at the clock. I think we're probably running out of time.
Yeah. So, well, I'll see you next week. Thank you for your insight again. Burma means a lot to me. It brings up a lot of issues with Asia and China and all this. But in the end, we're all one community now with international commerce. And so we really have to, the way you look at it is open up and be accepting. That matters a lot to all of us.
Yeah. Just leave you with one more thought back to where we were about the importance of military force. Al Capone, the big gangster in Chicago, was famous for saying, you get a lot more with a kind word and a gun than you get with a kind word.
Of course, you got to have the stick and the candy and the carrot. You got to have both.
You got to have both. Okay, Jimmy, thank you.
Have a good week.
Next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.